Hello, my name is Marco Treviso, and I will be doing a short video presentation about the Indians of Texas. I will begin with an introduction and follow up with a historiography, and in the middle I will give some examples of some Indian tribes that played an important role in the shape and the history of Indians in Texas. Not only the history, but how the Indian tribes were affected by the white settlers. Introduction. The pioneer people to settle in North America were the Indians to appeared as far as the time that the mammoths existed. The Indians at the time depended on hunting game, meat, and a collection of wild fruits such as the prickly pear. These were the main economic activities of this particular group. With time, their mode of living evolved as it was transformed by both human and physical process. An example of one physical process that transformed the lives of the Indians was the extinction of a larger game such as the mammoth, leading to the Indians settling for smaller game meat from animals such as hare and even snakes. The coming of the European settlers was a human process that had a major impact on the lives of the Indians. There were constant struggles between the Indians and the white settlers, which resulted to the Indians being driven farther south into Texas, given the fact that the settlers had both the machinery and resources that made them overpower the Indians who were living in the region. In any given part of the world where the settlers lived, the natives often found themselves on the receiving end in the sense that they ended up being the servants, or rather the slaves of the white settlers. In the process, the locals had to give up their rights, such as the land rights, and become the subjects to the superior white settlers, who had both the resources and reinforcements from their home countries to subject the natives into being their slaves. It thus suffices to say that coming of the European settlers in North America made the Indians be victims of circumstances in their native land. This paper looks at the historiography of the Indian tribes in Texas upon the arrival of the white settlers. The historiography. There are numerous Indian tribes that eventually ended up in Texas at a point in history. The tribes mainly functioned separately, and there were instances where there were intertribal warfare and alliances. Each of the tribes had a different role to play in the history of what is now known as the state of Texas, a name that was derived from the language of one of the Indian tribes. It is on record that historians derive their information from two major types of sources, namely primary and secondary ones. Primary sources are critical in providing first-hand information, while secondary sources provide second-hand information. Given the fact that the topic of the hand at hand, Indians of Texas is a pure matter whose information can only be unearthed through the use of historical facts. It is only prudent to argue that the historians applied mostly secondary sources of information in this respect. While gathering information on the Indians of Texas, historians had to employ secondary sources in their collection of facts. In this regard, the secondary sources were instrumental in trying to find out specific pieces of information in the fastest way possible. The collection of facts was used by the historians to find out whether specific tribes of the Indians in Texas lived, in the tracing of their migration to the present time, and in what specific years. This approach was very critical in making sure that the information gathered was very accurate for the purpose of enhancing the credibility of the final collected information so as to allow other persons to rely on it comfortably without casting any aspersions on the validity of the data therein. Furthermore, the historians, while studying the Indians of Texas, used a secondary source for the purpose of obtaining background material. This is critical, especially in the case where the historians were focused on one particular topic, but at the same time they needed to have knowledge on what else was happening at the specific times that impacted on the Indians of Texas, or rather what happened earlier. Their approach is very critical given the fact that the lives of people and societies at large are often affected by the prevailing circumstances or happenings, hence the need for such related information that is key in highlighting the historical events that prompted specific actions from the members of a given group. For instance, incidences such as the American Revolution and the American Civil War affected the Indians and their general behavior and reactions as they fought to preserve both their identity and territory, hence the need to have proper understanding of such relevant happenings. Moreover, facts do not speak for themselves, and as such, it is always an indispensable requirement for the historians to make and give shape to the fact and put them in such a manner that the readers can easily comprehend. Remember that any communication is useless until it can be understood by the audience. This is basically referred to as interpretation. It thus suffices to say that most of the secondary sources relied upon by the historians studying the Indians of Texas had to provide sensible information. These particular historians had to make sure that the secondary sources made sense of particular persons, events, and trends that were synonymous with the Indians of Texas. To make sure that the secondary sources relied upon had the kind of information that was making sense to the readers, such sources had to be accredited for the purpose of guaranteeing their availability, reliability, and credibility, without which they could be unreliable, and as such their interpretation could not as well be trusted. The historians researching on the Indians of Texas had to make sure that they properly interpret the secondary sources of information so as to be able to make sense of the historical facts. A properly done history must reveal not only the past events, but also present or current facts in the best way possible. In the final analysis, it is worth comprehending that the fact that the history can be best studied through secondary sources, and this makes reliance on primary sources very rare unless historians can interview people who had first-hand accounts of the events as they unfolded at the material time. This approach could not thus be persuaded by the historians who studied the Indians of Texas, as it was not easy to find people who had first-hand information in this respect. The method employed was that of secondary sources, which had to be relied upon to provide both facts and background information that is relevant to the Indians of Texas. The Alabama Coushatta is one of the tribes that I'm going to mention. The Alabamans and the Coushatta were distinct tribes. However, owing to the similarities in their culture, they were considered to be one tribe. Their migration into Texas began in 1763, and they moved from where Alabama is located presently to the Big Thicket in the southeastern region of Texas. The fact that they lead peaceful lives should not be mistaken for lack of skill of warfare. The Alabama and Coushatta engaged in campaigns that were against the Cara, Aswansas, as well as the Fredonia rebellions. In the year 1839, the Alabama and the Cara, Aswansas, as well as the Freedom Rebellions. In the year 1839, the Alabama and the Coushatta were able to drive the Comanche tribe out of the territory region. This was a more aimed and ensuring move that they could total control of the land in which they occupied without risking losing it to many other tribes. This was practice that most tribes engaged, especially where their outsiders were regarded as being weak and such unable to stage a reasonable resistance. When the reservation policy was introduced, Alabama moved in 1853 to Polk County in a reservation. 6 years later, in 1859, the Alabama were joined by the counterparts, the Coushatta, in the same reservation. The two tribes were a greater contribution during the Civil War as they helped in the transportation of weapons. Their contribution in the Civil War was acknowledged by some of the Confederate governors, such as Francis R. Lubbock and Pendleton Murray. However, a turning point in the 1070s occurred when the culture that they had preserved was threatened to perish with an influx of white settlers. It is worth mentioning that the white settlers often forced the locals to adopt their new ways of life, such as adopting Christian worship and the Western lifestyle, something that eroded the original culture of the natives in the long run. The changes brought about the white settlers affected the lives of the Alabamans and the Coushatta, both spiritually and economically. The tribe became specialized in Burgoyne lumbering as well as being assimilated into the Christian religion. Fortunately, at this time, Mr. Livingston, J.C. Fegan, strongly advocated on behalf of the tribes for an increment in the land available for cultivation and facilities of education. This was an important move given that agriculture was the backbone of the economy of the tribe and the education was necessary to improve overall lifestyle of the people. It was not only until the 1920s that the effort of Mr. Fegan started playing back when the federal government bought an addition of 300 acres of the Alabama Coushatta with additional and education facilities, hospitals, and gymnasiums. The federal government also recognized the tribes under the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, bringing the matters of two tribes under the federal government. This was both a unifying factor and something was meant to promote a civilized society that is free from oppression of the white settlers. The Apaches had established a dominion in West Texas with a vast region between Arkansas and Arizona. There were two groups of Apache that were of key importance, the Lipans and Mescalero. These two groups were among the first to learn the skill of riding horses. The riding of the horses was important for them as they lived a nomadic life as they followed game, especially buffalo. They complemented their nutritional diet by agriculture. The Apache planted several crops including pumpkins, corns, watermelons, and beans. 1700 saw a change in the way the Apache conducted their activities as the Spanish settlers arrived. They conducted numerous raids on the Spanish missions who were out to change the traditional lifestyles, but later had to form alliances with the Spanish to get protection from the Comanche. Such an alliance was informed by the fact that the Spanish were all equipped, and as such, they could provide great reinforcement in times of war. The Apache also took advantage of the arrival of Anglo-American into Texas. The Comanches had caused the Apache a lot of problems in cultivating a friendship relationship between them, and the Anglo-Americans seemed to be the best solution. However, the relationship went sour after the killing of a Lipan chief known as Flacan in 1842. The murder was believed to have been done by the white settlers. The Apache then crossed to Mexico border, where they began causing chaos as they sought to gain control of the land in the region now that they had already been displaced. The U.S. Army under Colonel Ronald McKenzie was sent to deal with Apaches destroying their villages. Those that survived were taken to the reserve in New Mexico. The Cherokee lived in the southeastern region and around Missouri. The effect of war and major epidemics caused the Cherokees to migrate willingly to the west in places such as Texas and Arkansas with the hope they would preserve their culture. War had such raving effects such as the destruction of property and loss of lives, something that had the capacity to weaken the community significantly. The migration of most of the members of this community from the war-torn areas was to save them from such destruction of war. Some who had opted to remain in the southeastern region experienced forceful removal into the Indian Territory in what was called the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee lived near the Red River as they became pushed by the settlement of Americans. In 1820, around 120 families in the region of the Chief Duel settled near the Cadiz in the Russ region. As more and more Americans settled close to them, there was no little test between the Cherokee and the Americans. The Cherokees therefore developed a friendship with Mexico to safeguard the ownership of their land, which was the most critical communal asset of that time. The friendship they had made with Mexico is what made them maintain a neutral position during the Texas Revolution. There was, however, a forceful advocate for the Cherokee tribe. Sam Houston was a member of the tribe through adoption, where he helped in the negotiation of a permanent reserve that is located in Texas. The demands were, however, not met by Congress of Texas. The reign of President Lamar saw the Cherokee engaged in a war against Texas. In 1839, the Cherokee defeated and taken to the Indian Territory. The Cheyenne were traditionally agriculturalists practicing agriculture in the Black Hills region. After they learned about horses, they changed their lifestyles and adopted nomadic culture while in pursuit of the buffalo. Together with the close allies, the Arapahoes, they dominated the land between Platte and the Arkansas River. The Iowa, Apache, and the Comanche were the traditional enemies of the Cheyenne, and the disputes they had were resolved in 1840. The 1850s saw the existence of differences within the Cheyenne community regarding the problems that their community was facing. The Cheyenne then enjoyed relative peace for about 10 years, where their main focus was trading with the Americans, Mexicans, and other Indian tribes. The community was dealing with the disease of cholera, declining of population of buffalo, as well as the threat of expansion of the Americans on their camping sites and their grounding hunting. Some of the chiefs opted to hold peaceful negotiations with Americans, while yet another section, commonly referred to as the Dog Soldiers, relentlessly waged war on the Americans. The U.S. Army was engaged in a number of wars that were meant to crush the Southern Cheyenne. There were two places where the battles are known to have taken place: the Battle of Sand Creek in 1864 and the Battle of Red River in 1868. The battles led to the Cheyenne moving and settling and restoration in Oklahoma. The Comanche were a powerful and strong Indian tribe. The tribe was comprised of active bands that totaled to no less than 8, with 5 of those bands being key members that shaped the history of Texas. The Comanche controlled trade and the trade items that were sold. The goods that were mainly sold were agriculture produce and products from the buffaloes and horses. The Comanche contributed many items in trade, as they were expert hunters and had many horses they had used in hunting. The 18th century was characterized with constant raids by the Comanche on the Spanish. The problems escalated until in 1785, where the Spanish made a peace treaty with the Comanche. This peace treaty was not honored by the Spanish, and the Comanche resumed the raiding on the Spanish. Soon after the Texas Revolution, some of the Americans wanted to settle on the plains of Texas in the western region. This area was inhabited by the Comanche, and they strongly refused Americans from encroaching onto their land. Both sides were hesitant to give up as the Comanche launched attacks against the frontier, while the frontier stood their ground and retaliated. It was during the reign of President Lamar that the conflict reached a peak. The strategy that President Lamar used was successful, and it succeeded in driving the Comanche to the west of the Red River, but a large collateral damage to both sides of the struggle. The diseases, however, empowered the Comanche tribe, and their number was greatly reduced. Due to the decrease in their number, the Comanche ended up in the Indian Territory in Oklahoma, while some were adamant and managed to counter the spread of the Americans west of the Texas Hill Country. In the 1870s, the Comanche tribe waged wars at the hunters of the buffaloes at a place known as Adobe Walls. This act by the Comanche triggered a retaliation reaction from the U.S. Army that was led by Colonel Ronald McKenzie. The U.S. Army destroyed the horses of the Comanche people had, rendering them powerless of the culture of the Comanche. Could not survive without the assistance of their horses. They had become heavily dependent on the horses to help in the hunting and raiding, which was no longer possible after the destruction of their horses. The Red River was ended in Palo Duro, and the Comanche started a transition that eventually led to live in a reservation life. The Shawnee migrated to escape the invasion of American settlers from the Ohio region and the Cumberland Valley of Kentucky. The Shawnee then settled on the lower bank of Red River, where they continued with the culture of hunting during the season of winter and cultivating crops during the warm seasons. They planted squash, corn, and beans. They maintained friendly and peaceful relationships with the Americans, Mexicans, and Indian neighbors. In 1832, the Shawnee assisted the Mexicans to fight the Comanche under the leadership of John Lenné. A treaty was made in 1836 with the Shawnee and President Sam Houston, which set aside the land for the use by the Shawnee tribe and several other Indians. The treaty failed to be ratified by the Senate of Texas. However, during the Cherokee War in 1839, the Shawnee maintained a neutral position in the war as they hoped to retain their culture in the 1840s. Shawnee received payment to relocate the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. The Indians also experienced victimization by the Europeans and later by the American government. It was during the coming of the Europeans into Texas that the Indians started experiencing diseases they had not previously encountered. The diseases heavily impacted the population of the Indians as they had no traditional ways of treating the diseases. The fact that the diseases had not been present before the coming of the Indians, and also that the Europeans were not greatly affected by the presence of the disease, initiates that the diseases could have been intentionally done to reduce the population of the Indians. The Europeans realized that the only way could reduce the resistance of the Indians was to reduce their population. The Indians had a very good knowledge of the terrain of Texas, and engaging their battle would be a risky affair. The Indians were also victimized by the American government after they had been overpowered in battle, which mainly led by Colonel Ronald McKenzie. The reign of President Lamar saw many Indians being brutally engaged in battle with the U.S. Army. The Indian survivors were then taken to live in reservations in Oklahoma, a region that were referred to as the Indian Territory. The effect of that action was that it resulted in more land in Texas for Americans to settle, while the Indians were congested and concentrated in the reservations. The Indians being concentrated in the reservations also assured that they would have no resistance, as it was easy to control them, especially when some were placed in forts. The government was also violating the freedom of movement of the Indians, as they were not allowed to settle freely in other parts as should have been. For the Indian tribes that were settled in Texas, formation of alliances was a paramount thing that happened occasionally. The alliances were formed because of various reasons, depending on individual Indian tribes and the conditions that prevailed at a certain time. One of the reasons why the Indians formed alliances was they offered security and safety for the weaker Indian tribes. The stronger Indian tribes also enjoyed more security and power by having, in addition, a population that would greatly contribute wars in times of need. The Allied forces could therefore carry out raids successfully about their high numbers without the fear of defeat. Another reason for the formation of alliances is that it also increased the resistance of the Indians against the encroachment. of the American into Texas. If the Indian tribes were to retaliate against the invasion of the Americans into the Texas region, they would have easily been defeated by the Americans. Merging up with other Indian tribes ensured that the Indians stood a better chance of resisting the Americans. The Arapaho formed an alliance with the Comanche, and together they resisted the Americans. The success of the Arapaho and the Comanche prevented the Americans from moving west of the hills. County can be attributed to the alliance of the Comanche and Arapaho forming an alliance which made them stronger. Conclusion. The information concerning the Indians have a lot of controversy gaps, missing links. The reason for the gaps in the information, the history of the Indians is a different source writing information according to how they received and understood it. The different European people who were present, the existence of the Indians was not well consonant with the different variations of Indian languages. The authors of the primary sources ended up using information that was not very clear to those relaying the information. The differences come in that the different sources containing the information could have information that was perceived different from how it was intended. The biased and wrong information has therefore been passed down by many generations, with each generation having information that has been further diluted and distorted. The distortion of the information has also erased them from the modernization of society. The society is no longer a community-based society, but a society that is based on individualism. A society where an individual is an important element does not favor the preservation of historical information. In the first place, it eliminates the ability to learn the aspects of a community, as there is no community to study in the first place. Consequently, information will be not transcend down the generation to be preserved. The modernization of society, therefore, presents a challenge to studying history of a community as large as and diverse as the Indians. The important thing to do while studying the history of anything, even including a community, is learning from previous mistakes that have been made in the course of history. After understanding the mistakes that could have been made during the course of history, better strategies can be employed in the future to try to prevent similar mistakes from being committed. History is a combination of lessons that should be learned carefully to ensure that there is an upward trend in the improvement of society from the position that it was previously in history. The history of the Indian tribes in Texas serves as a classroom of endless lessons that can be learned by the society to create a better future by correcting the mistakes of the past, especially with new technology that is at our disposal. The first lesson that can be learned is the violence that does not settle disputes, but it only aggravates a problem to an unimaginable level. When one tribe acted violently against another Indian tribe, the other Indian tribe would also retaliate in violence. This series of violent fights and retaliations created a never-ceasing cycle that kept on increasing the devastating effects of the original act of violence. Instead of settling the dispute at hand, the reactions of violence led to the loss of lives of the members of the Indian tribes. The loss of life is something that can never be resolved, but if the issue were addressed, they could have been resolved. The society should also look at a better method of solving the differences that exist between the members of the community. When diplomatic methods are used to solve issues, there is little likelihood of resulting in additional problems. Another lesson that can be drawn from this history of the Indians of Texas is the benefit of having unity even among a nation. For the tribes of Indians in Texas, the little unity that they had is what enabled them to hold resistance against the European long enough. The results would have been marvelous if all the Indians tribes were strongly united against the spread and the invasion of Europeans. The number of European settlers was little as compared to the vast number of the Indian tribes. The fact that the course of the European united them against the Indians contributed to their success. And some of the Indian tribes did not collaborate with the Europeans. The Indian tribes would have been more likely to defeat European settlers.